Thank you again for being here. So the world is awash in privacy concerns. I'm sure many of you are aware all of the state legislation that's being introduced. Also, various countries around the world are either enacting new data protection or privacy regulations, or in fact updating. That's what's going on in Canada. We're updating our privacy regulations to modernize, to be more sort of cognizant of the current privacy landscape, the concerns around privacy, the sort of changes in views, but also influence from other regulations such as GDPR in Europe. So the problem with this, of course, is that we start to see a lot of focus on risks. We see this in news media, we see this in research articles, we also see this in stakeholder consultations. There's a lot of focus on privacy and the risks around privacy, and less so around the benefits. Now, at this very event last year, we had Gartner come and talk to us about some of the surveys and interviews they had done with this community, with CDOs. They mentioned that data sharing was sort of a key pillar to the CDO role. So data sharing is a KPI. It is a key driver of success for the CDO. Now, of course, our focus is on the safe and responsible uses of data. And of course, this is not surprising in a sense when you think about the greater landscape. So when we talk about privacy, we talk about people's information. And more, what we're seeing is the information is connected. It's very easy to cross-correlate, to match data together. So increasingly, all data is becoming, in one form or another, personal. It's becoming about people. Now, as a company, we of course believe that trust is the foundation, as you heard just earlier, and in the title of this presentation. We feel that trust is that foundation that is needed to enable the uses of data safely and responsibly. Now, it's not surprising in a sense when you think about it. You yourselves, when you're working with a system or another organization, it's trust that's going to allow you to do that data sharing, to drive new analytical insights. But also within your organizations, what we find when working with organizations is that the key stakeholders that you're working with are also concerned. They see themselves. They see their family members, their friends in that data. So the more that they trust the uses of the data, the more likely they are to really engage, to see the benefits, and to really get behind the organizational outcomes that are trying to be pushed forward. Now, we're very fortunate today, go to the next slide, very fortunate to have two leaders with us. They're going to speak to basically the opportunities around trust. So we have with us physically here today, Stephen Bonner from the Information Commissioner's Office. The ICO is a data protection authority. So that means they're a regulator. They're very well known internationally, both nationally and internationally, for their innovative work and very practical work in engaging with stakeholders to understand the needs, trying to understand sort of what you're trying to do, how you're trying to push the benefits of data forward. And Stephen's going to talk to us sort of the future, the landscape of regulations, but also sort of the future in terms of new technologies, including AI. We also have with us online, virtually, Stephen Bamford from Janssen R&D. Janssen is a leading pharmaceutical company. They do a lot of really interesting work globally, collaborating, bringing different groups together to collaborate and figure out what is best practice. How do we move our industry forward? And he's going to speak to us sort of, at least in his industry, how things are sort of meeting those regulatory challenges. So if I can summarize, I would say that Bonner's going to give us a view of sort of where we're going, and Bamford's going to give us a view of how his industry is getting there. Now with that, I'll pass it on to you. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you. Good morning. Okay, now those online have an excuse because I shouldn't be able to hear them, but I should be able to hear the people in the room. Let's try that again. Good morning. Okay, that's more like it. Thank you. As introduced, I'm Stephen Bonner. I'm a Deputy Commissioner at the ICO, which is the UK's independent regulatory body set up to uphold information rights. We're responsible for regulating data protection and transparency through our freedom of information laws. My career has always touched on data in a number of ways. I started off as a deep internet technologist and then moved into financial services, where I took information risk roles, responsible for protecting $12 trillion a day of transactions and the personal data, privacy, and cybersecurity of 46 million customers. Then I moved to be a partner in the Big Four. Great to see some of them sponsoring the event today, where I helped organizations transform their cybersecurity and data privacy to deliver on their business goals. And finally, last year, I joined the regulator, particularly to lead on technology and emerging issues. I got asked, am I a gamekeeper turned poacher, or am I a poacher turned gamekeeper? We'll leave that for our thought. But what's the biggest message I've learned looking at this and looking to the future? And that message is, sustainable innovation is not threatened by high standards. So let's dig into that a little bit. I'm going to tell you about why this matters, what we're doing to help this kind of future preparation, and how we react should it go wrong. So why does it matter? We are absolutely at a crossroads. It's been fantastic to hear the illustrious history of this event, but what's happening now is we're at a tipping point. The scale, the type of applications that data are being used for, the pure impact they can have has gone through a phase change. The choices you make in the next few years will have a fundamental impact on the outcomes for the future for all of us. Let's make sure we make good ones. But before we do, let's delve into a couple of examples. COVID drove enormous digital transformation, but there was hesitance about people embracing how their data was shared and analyzed during the pandemic. In a large UK survey, the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation found that when they control for all the other variables, like good data scientists should, they found that trust in the rules and regulator was the single biggest predictor of whether someone believed digital technology should have a role in the COVID-19 response. And what was fascinating about that is that trust in governance substantially more predictive than variables I would naively have expected, such as concern about the pandemic, or even if these technologies could work or be effective at all. It also was far more predictive than demographic variables, such as age or education. It's very clear that rules and regulations matter for successful uptake of these technologies. But it doesn't always work. Looking at a US example, I was talking to a regulator over here, and they discovered an application, a mobile app aimed at children. And this app used a wide range of data about the child, their interests, their history online, to identify a pet for them in the virtual world that was created, a pet that the child could connect closely with. If the kid loves dinosaurs, they'd get a dinosaur. If they were obsessed with ponies, they got a pony. And the app then used a machine learning model to adapt behavior of the pet to form a deeper bond with the child, becoming an essential part of their daily life. Now, if this was a classic CDOIQ presentation, then this would be a powerful story about using data to improve education and mental health in children. But that kind of story isn't the things we share around the campfire with other regulators. This app decided to go in a radically different direction. Once the child was tightly bonded to the animal within the game, virtual animal control would arrive and take the pet away and say that it's going to be put down unless you pay a fine that was payable in real-world currency. That's pretty horrid, right? And I'm actually aware of an even worse use of data and AI that's more disturbing than that. But I'd like to be invited back to some of these future seminars, so I'm going to save that emotional damage for another day and leave you just with that application nugget. Now, when you reflect on the work that you're doing, you have a choice. You can work to build a world, a marvelous future that uses trust and unlocks the real value that data can offer. Or you can be doing the equivalent of slaughtering people's beloved pets, albeit virtually, hopefully, even if that behavior likely maximizes shareholder value, at least in the short term. I can't imagine many parents were particularly encouraging about that application. Now, I really hope this isn't a question you need to spend a lot of time pondering. And I know that many of the decisions you make are not this clear-cut. But in aggregate, the choices you're making about the future can lead us into very different worlds. I know you have the power to make a real positive difference about how data is used. So how do we as a regulator help you do this? So we heard on the first day, MIT has this motto, man, mind, and hand. Not hand and mind, not hind and mand. Let me get that right. Mind and hand. As the regulator, we act to cover both of those. We want to mix guidance that makes you think with practical interventions you can actually apply, all backed up with robust action if you don't. The ICO is absolutely committed to taking privacy by design from high-level policy into practical practice. A great example of this is our AI risk toolkit. There's been a lot of great work across the world that lays out high-level objectives for safe use of AI and big data projects. But how do you turn those principles into practical guidance that can actually be applied by developers and those leading these initiatives? Our toolkit lays out tangible controls that you can deploy to reduce risk from our views of the potential harms that these systems can pose. And given we're the transparency regulator, I can assure you it's exactly the same assessment methodology we'll be using when we're investigating and considering AI deployments and their level of compliance. But it's not just taking our guidance. You can talk to us. If you're doing something really weird and you're worried that maybe you can't secure investors for it because of regulatory risk. Maybe you think all your hard work will build up and then be stopped by a regulator coming to stop you. Great. Well, no, it's not great that you're worried about it, but it's great because we can actually help with that. We have a regulatory sandbox that we use to delve deep with the members and co-create great solutions that give them innovation but respect data rights. Among our currently running sandbox projects, we're working with projects that use data to protect problem gamblers. We're using data to tackle homelessness. We're providing targeted support for veterans based on the data around them. And we're working with financial data in at least 3 large projects. One looking at tackling criminal money laundering, one enabling fintechs to grow and flourish, and one to work to cut the poverty premium, the perverse situation where poor people using financial services pay higher fees than rich people using those same services. If you're doing something only a little bit weird, we have an iAdvice service for innovators who can reach out with difficult questions they're facing around data protection, and we'll give them fast, frank feedback to allow them to move forward with confidence and do the innovation to develop the solutions that we all need. And we understand this is a team sport. We work shoulder to shoulder with other regulators, both in the UK and around the world. We're working very closely to resolve data and competition issues within the ad tech industry with the UK Competition and Markets Authority. And we know that many innovative companies operate in several parts of the digital ecosystem, potentially covered by different regulators. So we founded and are part of the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum across 4 main regulators in the UK to harness our collective expertise when data, privacy, competition, communications, and content all interact, as I'm sure it does in many of the projects you work with. Joining up allows us to give consistent guidance and reduces the cost of doing the right thing so the economy can flourish while people are properly protected. At its heart, privacy rules are a how-to, not a don't do. But we also need help to make sure there's a level playing field so that those organizations that follow the rules are not outcompeted by those who might cut corners or do things poorly. I always listen to the great philosophers around this. The greatest philosophers of our generation, Warren G. and Nate Dogg, in their seminal work Regulate, said, "But you can't be any geek off the street. Got to be handy with the steel, if you know what I mean. Earn your keep. Regulators, mount up." Now, I pretty much am just a geek off the street, and it is wonderful to be here with my own people and in the MIT world. But at work, I'm surrounded by skilled investigative and enforcement professionals who are handy with a vital impact. For example, last month, the ICO fined Clearview AI £7.5 million for using images of people in the UK that were collected from the web and social media to create a global online database to develop and train facial recognition technology that was then sold to law enforcement and other organizations. That processing wasn't fair or transparent. People were not made aware, and they had no expectation that their personal data from their social media would be used by a completely different organization to train AI models in this way. In addition to our fines, we ordered the firm to delete the data of UK residents within its systems. Other regulators are leaning in as well. In the US, the FTC went one step further, and in the case of WW International, the firm formerly known as Weight Watchers, they required the firm to destroy algorithms they developed using ill-gotten children's data, in addition to deleting the original data and paying a monetary penalty. If you cut corners and exploit people, the bill is going to come due. But my work isn't about bringing threats. It's about bringing the promise of what regulated data can do for all of us. So, now you know why it matters, some of the ways that we can help you achieve the right outcomes, and what might happen when it goes wrong. At its core, regulation enables trust. Trust enables innovation, and innovation enables success. Let's be successful together. Thank you.
Okay, we're now going to watch a recording of Stephen Bamford at Janssen. He's going to talk to us about the realities of data inside the drug development process and give us sort of a vision of trust for his industry. So if we can play the recording now, that'd be great. Thank you.
Hello. I'm extremely humbled to be invited to speak with you all today. CDOIQ does such great work. and I hope you find my thoughts around how it's possible to shape a data sharing strategy through trustworthy data sharing and analytics helpful and both useful. I work for Janssen Research and Development. It's the pharmaceutical part of Johnson & Johnson. Responsible data sharing and reuse is high on our agenda, and having a standards framework is part of the solution. Today, I thought I would spend a short time talking to you about the steps we take when working with data collection and the harmonisation of healthcare data. As I'm sure you appreciate, we collect a myriad of variables in order to understand health interactions. I'll briefly touch upon our internal standards from data collection to drug submission, and I'll show how we manage complex data pipelines. After drug submission, we look to reduce the burden on trial participants by making the best use of data to drive innovation, linked to this new vision for the industry, the safe data standard, where ethical and responsible data sharing of anonymized data is charted out. And then finally, I'll say a few words about how we look to build trust in data reuse. So I've got some slides. So on this first slide here, this slide depicts that each clinical trial can collect thousands of data points. We need to understand chemical and health interactions in the drug development process. All this data arrives in many different formats, but today I'm just going to focus on the clinical trial data, the human data. Before technology, as we know it today, a doctor used to fill out a paper-based form with the health data transcribed from the records of the hospital. Since about 2000, this got pushed online. And over time, some of this has come in through electronic data sources. For example, lab data would be sent through as a file, not transcribed onto paper, and then laterally a website. Over time, the percentage of electronic data sources has increased. Today, it stands at 60%. But this 60% can come from about 15 or 20 different vendors. In the future, we will see electronic health records automatically copy from hospital computer systems straight into study databases. All this data needs to be combined into a single source to enable review, cleaning, and then data analysis. It takes many years of research to develop a drug and submit to a health regulator. And by then, much will change in terms of the data needed for drug approval. So there's a need to capture a lot of information now and store it in a way that can be combined for a submission. We are essentially talking about multiple functional groups working across the drug development process with thousands of mapping rules for billions of data points for a new clinical trial. Like many drug development companies, we have developed our internal data standards. On this next slide, you can see how we manage them here at J&J. These are to manage complex data pipelines and serve several purposes in drug development. We have global standards. These are across the whole company. And then we hone in at a therapeutic area level, a TA level, and then, if required, some therapeutic areas can be very, very wide and have many diseases within that therapeutic area. So we then have disease area standards that sit underneath here. We pull together all the standards for a specific study into something that we call a data lifecycle plan, a DLP. And this essentially serves as the instruction manual for harmonizing our clinical data across studies within a drug program. So whichever function and whichever group is working on it, it's basically what they know and how they're going to work on that study. Across the industry, every drug company has a slightly different set of internal data standards. And now that depends on the size and complexity of their own operations. Some pharmaceutical companies might only be in 1 or 2 therapeutic areas, where larger companies like Roche or J&J or GSK might have 5, 6, 7, 8 different therapeutic areas. They do all converge towards a recognized and actually required by regulatory submission in America, in Japan, and in China, a global standard. It's called the CDISC SDTM. Now, CDISC stands for the Clinical Data Interchange Standards Consortium. That's why everyone calls it CDISC. And SDTM is the Study Data Tabulation Model. And what's happened over time is that the regulators build their set of computer programs off SDTM, this tabulation model. So that's why they require all the companies to converge on this single model. Now, of course, there's many flavors of this. So it's not a complete harmonized mapping if you were to look between companies. The submission of the trial data itself per study usually comprises of about 50 different domains or 50 different data sets with thousands of variables, and this is what we consider the raw data. We also have standards for derived data from this raw data, and that is essentially one step away from the analysis. It's the analysis data model, or aptly called the analysis data analysis model, called ADAM. But for most people focus on SCTM as the main source, and then ADAM is just your analysis standard. And behind both of these, there's metadata. And this metadata drives the standards. Now, after 10 years in the industry, we're all still learning how to use, how to update, how to report, and how to store all this metadata in a repository format. There are several companies out there, several products out there, but there's not a clear way of succinctly doing this, because every company is different. And not only is every company different, on reflection, you need to acknowledge that we're fundamentally dealing with patients, people, and in very, very complex clinical trials. Now, not only are clinical trials complex, but people are complex. We're all complex machines. Therefore, the data we collect is more likely to contain individual situations that require finessing to fit into the data model. So I'm going to move on to the next slide now. And what I'm hoping to show here is that it takes over a decade to develop a new medicine. It costs billions of dollars, and there is an extremely small 0.01% chance of success from a compound in preclinical research in a lab to run all the way through to being a doctor's surgery. Of course, the earlier you can kill things off and kill quickly, the cheaper it becomes. The longer that goes, the more money that gets spent, the costs do go up exponentially. At J&J, we always look to reduce the burden on the trial participants by making the best use of the data. By the appropriate and safe use of the clinical data, we can accelerate research discoveries by improving access to that data. There's regulatory recognition of the benefits that come, and overall, we're always looking to improve health outcomes. And trial participants, don't forget, they expect the effective use of data about them, including the reuse of data, provided that the appropriate safeguards are in place. On this slide, I'm going to refer that earlier this year, a paper was written that outlines a vision for the industry to characterize and classify the balance between data transformation and preserved data utility. It's envisaged that this will help drive the ethical and responsible data sharing of anonymized data. Through a spectrum of identifiability, the paper draws inference in transformation that is proportional to the controls that are in place to prevent linking to other sources of information. The more information you have, the more sources there are, the more chances of people being able to make a link. It's hoped that the safe data standard will empower organizations to make decisions more efficiently and consistently, and to be based on a common sharing scenario. For example, data sharing platforms and portals like Vivly or the Yoda project or CSDR. There's several of them out there. These shares shared interests then build to create an opportunity for greater standardization. But there is no need to keep polishing the product. A framework like this will get standardization close enough so that it gets to the point where there's no return on investment in driving it any further forward. On my final slide, I'd like to close by concluding that the future of data reuse will be highly correlated with the need to include trustworthy analytics that will enable reuse of that data. We're shaping the end-to-end Janssen research and development strategy. This span covers from the key pipeline and portfolio decisions right through to the new strategic initiatives that will deliver on transformational medicines for patients. By far, the greatest impact for data science within the healthcare space is going to be the insight and the value generation from the reuse of data. Whether this is the use of novel data-driven medical insights, the development of more targeted treatments, or even as fundamental as helping accelerate drug development by reducing the timelines of running clinical trials. Of course, this is only possible when you consider the importance of cross-discipline and cross-team collaboration. There's a strong need to build a team experience in both medical science and also data science. We need to bring the best minds, the best minds from both inside the team and outside the team via many collaborations and partnerships. This is critical for success and critical to ensure the best use of patient data. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. That was really insightful. It's interesting to hear the complexity of the entire pharma development or drug development pipeline to see sort of, I mean, I personally wasn't aware of all the steps that go in place. It's interesting to hear about the sort of the endpoint, of course, the submission piece. That makes sense. But I'm curious because you talked about the sort of the complexity as well as the variation between different companies, how they're collecting data, how they're processing. They have their own standards, I suppose. So why have standards become such an important piece of drug development?
Oh dear. This is another 10-minute presentation, but there's the obvious, right? So the obvious is cost. Things are super expensive now. And drug development isn't unique in that area. So the more you can standardize, the more you can reuse, the lower you can keep costs. Now cost is part of it, but your traditional triangle of cost, quality, and time. Probably time is basically the most important of the three. Although all three are important, of course, but time because the patients are waiting, and the longer it takes you to do a clinical trial, the longer it takes to get the drug to market to the people who actually need it. So by having standards, not only can you save cost, you can also save time, and also you can help ensure quality because you're reusing work and things are already known to the people who are using them. But fundamentally, the need for standards, it all comes back to the fact that the regulators, the health regulators, are pushing so that they can do they can use their own computer software, as I mentioned earlier on, and potentially they could even look to compare between different companies' drugs. Like if there's a migraine drug that's already out there and another company brings a migraine drug, if they've got the same data structures, the regulators can do comparison analysis a lot more easily. So improving efficiencies, mainly time, but basically it's also a massively complex process of taking a drug compound to market. And because it can last for years and years and years, some people might only do it once, do a particular task once or twice in their careers. So by not having a standard process, it does actually cause confusion and errors can creep in. Now this is partly why 15, 16 years ago, I founded a group called Fuse. And basically this group, it's a not-for-profit organization that allows pre-competitive knowledge sharing. Basically, whichever company you're in, whether you're in a healthcare company or a service company, or if you're an independent consultant working in the healthcare space, you all essentially have to do the same job. You have to design the collection, you have to collect the data, you have to store the data, you have to analyze the data, you have to report the data. We all do the same tasks. So Fuse allows a pre-competitive knowledge sharing. Now, what we did after a few years is working with, first of all, the FDA, but then also realizing that there were opportunities to support the EMA in Europe and Health Canada, was we actually looked to not design standards, but we looked to implement standards or provide guidance, implementation guidance on how to implement either a standard or a requirement. And if you think about data sharing for particular, the EMA have a policy, Health Canada also have a policy, and even though transparency has been broadly defined, what that means in practice for companies, that's where Fuse, for example, stepped in and open to all, whether you're a service provider, whether you're a healthcare company or even a regulator or a software company. We basically bring it all together so that everyone's views are considered, and overall an implementation guide can be produced.
Excellent. Thank you, Stephen. You mentioned also at the end of your presentation, and I think it ties in nicely to what you were just discussing in terms of the industry group that you founded. I'm curious, you talked a little bit about the future. So what is on your radar for future drug development, and in particular the data landscape?
I guess there's three things. So I think what we should be seeing is basically more harmonization of data earlier in the process. So if we can push the submission or the analytics earlier into the drug development cycle, that will then cut out the amount of work, the check-in, the data errors that crop in further downstream. Now there are projects out there. There's one by Accumulus Synergy. Accumulus.org is their website. That's a charitable, not-for-profit organisation. They're working not only with the pharmaceutical companies but also with the healthcare agencies. What they're going to go, and instead of what happens at the moment, which is where a pharmaceutical company will run the clinical trials and then they'll package it all up into a lorry load of, well, it used to be a lorry load of paper. It's now just a web link. But basically, that then gets submitted to the regulators, and then the pharmaceutical companies sit back and wait for the questions to come in, and then eventually, hopefully, the approval letter. It's a bit more complicated than that, but that's in essence what it is. What Accumulus Synergy are proposing is that there is continuous monitoring and development and discussion throughout the life of the drug development process with health regulators. So it's more of I guess watching an ECG trace live rather than waiting for the doctor to tell you at the end that everything's okay. Obviously, it's not at that granular level of detail, but in essence, that's essentially what they're trying to do. The third thing that's probably worth mentioning, and it's a little early, but synthetic data. That's still emerging as a possible viable option for some use cases. Health regulators are still evaluating this, and data privacy organizations are still evaluating this, but there may very well be a place for synthetic data in the future of drug development.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Stephen. And thanks so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
No problem. Thanks for the invite again.
So Stephen, we heard, well, hopefully at the beginning, I talked a little bit about the Gartner results last year on data sharing being one of those key success drivers for the CDO. So, and you talked a lot about trust as well. So kind of curious to know, how do governments and a regulator, how do they help in the sense of driving forward so the responsible uses of data?
I mean, there's a wide range of things they do, but I think something sort of breaking news that's quite fascinating at the moment is there's a US-UK pets project, not the type of pets I was talking about earlier, I'm happy to say, but privacy-enhancing technologies, where there's a bilateral innovation prize fund, and there's a couple of challenges they're looking at. Another great philosopher out there is Adam Ant, who said, stand and deliver your money or your life. And in this challenge, they're looking at international money laundering and they're looking at health data because there are obviously concerns about sharing some of our most intimate details, the day-to-day details of our life across borders into potentially countries that may not offer the same high standards or have different approaches to things. And yet, if we can find ways to safely share that data, we can do things that all societies agree are great. Improving health outcomes, reducing financial crime. And this is where these privacy-enhancing technologies are adding. And it's a way of adding a great deal of trust by not having to rely on people doing what they'll say they do, but enforcing it, using code, using mathematics to apply constraints that are immutable. And that way, people can be very comfortable and confident about what they're doing. That means more people are willing to provide their data, more data can be used, and we get to better outcomes. I think it's fantastic to see government supporting innovation in this space because it will lead to better outcomes for everyone without any privacy risks around it.
Are there any other similar sort of initiatives that your office is involved in?
Yeah, I mean, we get plugged into these things early because obviously we have a bit of weight that we're willing to call out things that aren't going well. So when we are involved in something and say, yes, this meets our requirements, it gives confidence and trust. So there's one of the other sort of societal challenges going on at the moment is how do we provide a safe space online that's protected by encryption, but has content moderation and protection for children, say, using those services? How do we mix online safety with end-to-end encryption? So we're working with something called the Online Safety Tech Challenge to try and find ways to not force people to choose between one or the other, but actually find effective ways to deliver both of those. Because if you're not private online, you're highly unlikely to be safe. So we need to find something that does both rather than get lost in some strange trade-off between these two vital requirements.
Excellent. So we heard from Stephen Bamford a lot about, obviously, drug development, health data, and you mentioned just health data in that PETS work that's going on. I'm curious, now, in our experience, health data is a great area in which to sort of set best practice because it is very sensitive information, so it's a great area to sort of develop the right frameworks for data sharing in a safe and ethical way, which is what Bamford spoke to as well. What do you see, like you mentioned a little bit of this already, but what do you see as sort of some of the most promising innovations, at least so far, that are being developed?
Yeah, I mean, I think health data, you're exactly right. If we can get it to work in that environment, it will almost certainly work in a wide range of other ones. As I touched on my career history, I spent a lot of time in financial services. And in financial services, when we lose data, my previous bosses would be very unhappy to hear this, but it is just money. We can replace that, and it's relatively easy to replace the data, to reissue credit cards, to reissue authentication. I did walk past the CRISPR lab on my way here this morning, but for most people, it's quite hard to change the fundamental parts of their medical data. So we're in the UK, there's some really interesting work that I think is quite telling for the future and aligns to some of sort of the Web3 decentralization work called trusted research environments. So traditionally, the model would be, and we've heard about it in previous sessions, you'd build a kind of data lake and you absorb all the data from all the locations and put it in one place. And that's great for doing analysis, but it's quite concerning if that is compromised, and anyone who wants to use that data is given a copy, making it harder and harder to have transparency about where your data is, what it's being used for, almost impossible to audit it. When we come to investigate, we often find it's been accidentally shared with the wrong people who then shared it with someone else, and it's just disappeared. In a trusted research environment, the queries go to the data rather than the data going to the queries. I think this is really fascinating because A, you get an excellent audit trail of everything that's been done, and B, the people only get the answers they need. Quite often they don't need all that. They need to be able to process that detail, but they don't need the detail in the outcome. So by sending a question in and getting an answer back, it could be as straightforward as the answer is that drug doesn't work. And that immediately solves the problem, and instead billions of people data have been held centrally. And of course, in medical data, there's also the problem that often they're immense data fields. Medical imaging, human genome data are enormous files. So when you get population scale sets of this, it becomes practically impossible. Now, I'd like to hope that these innovations and works are there to protect privacy, but I think they're also saving cost and making it practicable, which are good outcomes as well.
Excellent. Now, hopefully we can bring in Stephen Bamford as well. I've just got the 5-minute hand signal, so let's get Stephen on, and if there's anyone in the audience who would like to ask a question, we'll take one from the audience first.
Hello, Stephen.
Hey, Stephen. Hi, Luke. Hi, everyone.
Hello. Go ahead, Michael.
Yes, good morning. The question I'd like to ask is a reversal of a couple of the words in the title of this session. It's the term data trust. I hear a fair bit from data practitioners in the UK about the power and promise of data trust, but we're not seeing much progress here in the United States, and I wonder if you have any progress that you could share with us that would give us hope for the use of that mechanism as a legal way of sharing data in a trusted fashion. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think at the core, one of the challenges we face around data is the asymmetry. Often we're individual customers facing off against billion-dollar organizations. And those organizations spend huge amounts of time and effort in carefully curating experiences that nudges in the directions that they want us to go in, not what's necessarily best for us. And the idea of a data trust is an element of sort of collective bargaining, to say instead of negotiating with each individual, we as individuals come together and we place our data in a body that then has sort of power and control over that, and can make good decisions for us based on that. And by having a massive volume of data that's potentially available, it leads to a much more equitable discussion with other parties who might want to have access to it. I think it's one of those ones that's one of those sort of changes of mindset, and those are sometimes difficult to initiate because obviously if you have a small data trust with very few people's data in it, it's not particularly tempting to engage with it. So there's a little bit of a bootstrap problem, but I think there's lots of interest and I think lots of hope that this gives us capabilities here. And I think, again, as we move to a more decentralized model, being able to connect our own personal data stores becomes a lot easier because often at the moment, it's quite difficult for users to actually have control and access to their own data. So I think data trusts are a really fascinating model. There's definitely lots of good legal work to support that. We now just need that push to get it over into practical, to get the scale, to get the uptake and have it be a practical approach, which I think is certainly possible. Yes.
Yeah. Now, Stephen Bamford, just want to make sure we get a question in for you as well. I don't know, did you want to speak to data trust or should I ask you another one? I'm not sure if you've worked with them in your experience.
No, I don't have any experience with data trust.
Okay, perfect. So we've had a few questions, a lot of questions actually, so a very short amount of time. Perhaps you could talk to, one that I kind of at least piqued my attention was this idea that standards can stifle innovation. And since you talked a lot about standards, I thought that might be a good one that maybe you could weigh in on. Do you find in your experience the kind of standards that you're speaking about at least, are they stifling innovation or are they actually a vehicle in some way?
Yeah, they tend to be a vehicle actually, Luke. The standards that the industry are currently, have been working on and continue to work on are basically looking to standardize the way that data is collected across companies and by default then globally. And the models that are being used allow for essentially an infinite amount of data, but the way each of the models is built, it basically allows computers to read in whatever the variable, whatever the data field is, but in a consistent way across any study, any therapeutic area, or any company. So it's basically more of a standardized way of collecting and storing the information, rather than saying that you can only collect this data. There's basically always you can add whatever data you collect it in the clinical trial. It's just that it needs to be collected in a way that that mechanically it's stored in the right way with the right variables.
Excellent, thank you so much. So I think we are out of time. I want to thank our guests for being here. I think that was really great conversation. Thank you for the insights. If anyone wants, of course, I know we didn't get a chance to respond to all the questions. Stephen and I are going to be here, and also Privacy Analytics booth is just outside the door if you want to come and see us and ask a few more questions. So thank you very much, Robert.
Thank you very much indeed, Stephen and Luke.
Thanks for joining us for this Q&A session. My name is Luke Arbuckle, Chief Methodologist and Privacy Officer at Privacy Analytics. With me today are Stephen Bamford, Head of Clinical Data Standards and Transparency at Janssen Research and Development, and also Stephen Bonner, Deputy Commissioner and Executive Director of Regulatory Futures at the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK. Our guests were kind enough to take time out of their busy schedule to join us again to answer questions that we didn't get to in a previous discussion. So thank you both for being with us today. Now, how about we start with you, Stephen Bonner? What are some of the barriers to adopting innovations in privacy-enabling technologies?
So we see privacy-enhancing technologies as an amazing improvement in how things operate. They're not a silver bullet. They need to fit in a wider framework. When we engaged with people through a recent project and developed with them what were the barriers, we found there was uncertainty about data protection law and how it applies to pets, what the benefits of deploying them would be from a legal and regulatory point of view. The costs of development and adoption weren't always clear or well understood, so that stood as a barrier. Gaps in the technical and legal expertise required to get the best out of them, and a lack of interoperable standards. So one of the things we've done just recently is publish some draft guidance around using pets to try and remove some of that uncertainty, to allow people to take these and use them comfortably. And the other thing is, just a couple of weeks ago, I was over in Bonn at the G7 meeting presenting our paper around pets, because we think no one country alone can do this. The real benefits are where these standards become across large parts of the world, so that organizations with an international footprint, or those looking to serve customers or customers looking to take services from other countries, can take advantage of getting these in a way that they know what they're getting, they're simple and easy to deploy, and they get enormous benefit. So I'm quite excited about what these might offer us as a way of not just relying on contracts to provide private experience, but actually enforcing it within the technology. Should be really interesting.
Excellent. And Stephen Bamford, I know that you have experience with using various technologies, some of these privacy-enhancing technologies. What are you seeing in terms of the adoption of these innovations, and what do you think might be limiting some of their adoption as well?
Yeah, good question. So I think the issue is that when dealing with healthcare, people are very conservative and very cautious. So it's taken a long time for a normalization to become mainstream. Prior to that, it was just very blunt force redaction. You got synthetic data waiting in the wings at the moment as such. But I think the differences between jurisdictions and companies aren't helping the situation at the moment. I think if there was a single playing field, I think we'd be in a lot better position.
And I think, Stephen, you bring out there precisely that. So that medical data is one of the most sensitive and vital ones. We also see financial data as something people have a great deal of concern over, and it's been quite fascinating. We're providing some support. There's a US-UK joint challenge where the governments are offering up prize money for those organizations that find really interesting ways of being able to share both medical data, but also in other contexts, financial data, to allow things like tracking pandemics and keeping them under control, or sharing financial data to identify terrorist financing, money laundering, those kind of things. So providing people's confidence and trust they can share data across borders so we get a safer world is quite a powerful thing. And I think medical data is absolutely the core of this, because any solution that works well with that data is highly likely to be able to work reasonably well with other less sensitive areas. So I think you're at the cutting edge of what's being done here, and vitally so.
Yeah, last week in a personal situation, I had to contact 9 different financial institutions in the UK for the same request, and all 9 of them have got a completely different process for the same request, and I find it quite confusing, and I don't mind a spreadsheet, I don't mind a form, but I can imagine people are overwhelmed by this. And, we work in a global environment, and, we're used to having different plugs in the UK, in Europe, in America, but someone developed an adapter, and all of a sudden we can travel and we have access to power wherever we are, but we're not quite at that stage yet when it comes to data sharing.
Well, I think this is the hope of things like open banking in the UK, where by offering common APIs and connections, but with privacy and security built in from the start, we can begin to offer that kind of adapter plug where, as long as each institution meets the standards, each consumer can contact all of them and I think it's probably not at the level of things you were trying to achieve, but collecting balance information, doing simple fund transfer between wallets within their system. These are starting to be available. And I think that this push to try and get data to be open and accessible, but building in the privacy control so people feel willing to trust it, I think offers a really exciting possibility here. So I think the future is bright in this area. There's lots to do, but some exciting times ahead.
And Stephen Bamford, you have in your title, and you've talked about this before, so I'm kind of curious, how do you see standards playing a role? Or is it even too soon for standards in this area, given the fact that it's evolving very quickly, and the plugs don't yet exist? But do you think standards could play a role in helping with some of that coordination?
Yeah, we already do have standards within healthcare data. Unfortunately, we have too many of them. So there's the clinical trial standards. Acronym City, there's CDISC and SDTM and ADAM, and then there's wider healthcare standards such as Health Level 7, the HL7. So I guess part of the challenge when dealing with healthcare is that somebody goes into a clinical trial and we collect an amount of data through that clinical trial on essentially an electronic book for that clinical trial, but there's so much more other data going on in their life, in their previous history, which at the moment is not easily accessible as part of the clinical trial. Now, of course, there's the questions around should it be and what exactly is needed, but the electronic health records that people have, being able to bring them into a clinical trial might very well help, especially with like long-term extension data where you might want to follow someone for 5 to 10 years, and it would be a lot less burdensome on the patient if there was a way of feeding their electronic health records securely, of course, into the clinical trial database.
And Stephen Bonner, you've talked about this a little bit, but maybe you could expand a little bit as well, because the ICO does a lot of work in terms of guidance and international collaboration. You mentioned the PETs and US, UK. And you mentioned the G7 recently as well. So maybe you expand a little bit about that in terms of like standards as well in the privacy space. What are you kind of seeing in terms of development?
Yeah, I mean, a core of the G7 work is a project initiated by Japan around data free flow with trust. That particularly the G7 and similar Western democracies have. There's different legal systems, there's different approaches to these things, but at its heart, there's a shared kind of common understanding about how a country should operate and the benefits of operating in that way. So that gives us a kind of common mindset to try and find sensible ways to allow data to flow, because that way consumers can take the best services in the world, organizations can have a much wider user base without adding extra layers of friction and inconvenience. So it's quite fascinating. The other thing we've done in this space quite a lot is that we kind of see the law and regulation provides a sort of minimum baseline, but it's quite a low baseline. It's like a sort of restaurant inspector saying there's no glass in the food. Well, that's great. I definitely want to be eating in restaurants that don't have glass in the food, but I'm looking for a bit more reviews that give me a bit of a sense about, do I want just a cheap and quick and easy fast food, or do I want to go to fine dining? And I think a lot of the work we're trying to do is engage with industry to get them defining what under the UK privacy rules are called codes of conduct and certification schemes, where a group who've decided something that's way above the bare minimum baseline can come together, set standards, and prove that they're meeting that. And we think this is quite fascinating because it enables customers to make an informed choice. Okay, I'm glad it doesn't have glass in it, but actually I want fair trade organic food, and that's certified so they know they're actually getting that. And that way, as well as just, a lot of our enforcement work is finding people below that minimum threshold and stopping them. We want to find ways where those above, those adding extra capabilities and services and looking after people even better, can flourish and thrive, and that the market will make choices and consumers can pick the brands they want. And I think if there aren't clear standards that are interoperable across nations, we end up with just a lot of confusing symbols and names that consumers just can't tell whether what they're getting, and often may be bamboozled by false claims or at least exaggeration. So this way, we're looking to have industry come together, set these codes and certs, and that way those that are willing to go a bit further can differentiate themselves and grow their market. Because what we've seen when talking to individuals in the countries, they want this. People want their data to be respected and looked after. They just haven't felt they've had control to this point. And I think by setting clear standards and allowing organizations to demonstrate they're passing above the bare minimum, I think that's a really interesting way of lifting the bar for everyone. A race to the top rather than an unfortunate race to the bottom.
Yeah, we've seen the same sort of thing in healthcare over the years. That there's been collaborative agreements in place where people come up with a standard for data sharing. The problem is when you're talking to 30, 40 different companies to come up with a standard that everyone can agree to, a progressive company quite easily meets those standards and exceeds them and goes beyond them almost all of the time.
Excellent. I think this is a good opportunity now to kind of switch to a topic that always comes up when we talk about privacy. So Stephen Bamford, maybe you can continue on a little bit and talk about the needs of transparency and consent with the second uses of clinical data, because consent always comes up. So maybe you could give us a little bit of background on that.
Yeah, sure. So with respect to healthcare data, of course, now people go into clinical trials. They obviously want their data to be used to advance science and create medicine. And we have to make sure that data is always going to be used ethically appropriately. And we feel that we've got an obligation really to be good stewards of their data, to ensure that it's going to be used appropriately and to ensure that the benefits flow back into the public in a credible way. And I guess there's three things that I could talk about here. The first would be informed consent. The need to have a clear understanding of the benefits and the risks of research. I put my back out earlier, sorry. We need to be transparent about how data is going to be used, and we need to allow study participants the opportunity to make an informed decision. And that could be to withdraw consent, should they want to. It's inappropriate, really, to have burdensome documents and long requirements as a condition of someone participating in research. It needs to be clearly understood and in plain language. The second thing, I guess, is autonomy. We need to respect these individuals. Now, we spoke about privacy enhancing technologies. Now, they make certain, or they very may make certain transactions legal and possible. But ultimately, the source is still a human being. And just because we can share the data, it doesn't necessarily mean we should share the data. So increasing the strength of the patient voice and demands around what their data is being used for, those are things that we like to consider. Now, the final topic on this is justice. And we need to have a fair distribution of the benefits and the burdens of research. And like all companies here at Janssen, we conduct research to make products available to patients. And these patients, right, they go into the trial, they're contributing their time, their bodies, and ultimately they are placing themselves at an element of risk without any guarantee of benefit from that trial. And as a company, we find it's appropriate to restrict commercial use of that data and to ensure that the benefits actually do flow back to the general public or to the individuals who participated in the research.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Stephen. Stephen Bonner, kind of continuing on in that area, you know, in different circumstances, it'll be potentially harder to get individual consent. How does, as a regulator, how do you balance that, you know, need and desire to, you know, respect individuals, get consent, but also the desire to drive innovation as well, to show that privacy enhancing technologies, you know, can move things forward? So how do you kind of balance those two?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of one of the big, if I could rewind time and change how we position things. First of all, consent, it's a terrible name because it's sort of become this idea in common language. It sort of means grudgingly accept, you know, I consent to that happening. Whereas what we're looking for here is enthusiasm. We want consumers who are delighted and bought in and fully get it. And often, particularly under UK data protection law, consent is often wildly inappropriate, and there are far better records to have a lawful basis. And I think, unfortunately, we disappear into a sort of complex legalese and data experts, whereas the myth that sort of spreads, oh no, you've got to have consent before they use their data. And often in circumstances where the power imbalance is so huge, there's no hope to actually get meaningful consent. It's still important to get their approval, but that's not going to give you the lawful basis, because the high standard required for consent means offering individuals real choice and control. It puts individuals in charge, it builds trust and engagement, and enhances the reputation of people who offer that. But often that isn't the experience that people have with consent. They're given pre-tick boxes, they're manipulated through very extensive levels of A/B testing to, you know, we're all aware of the pre-ticked, the gray font somewhere, the options already configured for you. We're so used to having become manipulated like this, it's really eroded the trust in things that operate. So I think there's sort of a moment to step back and think, of course, you need approval, but that may not be enough. And you've got to genuinely empower people, or you're not actually giving consent. And unfortunately, many of the experiences people have day in, day out are having what they're being told they're giving consent, and they're really not. And what's quite fascinating is, as us and other regulators have started applying pressure in this space, we're starting to see people genuinely being offered a choice. And I saw one commentator explain from their analysis, the only people opting into some of these things when given a free choice are those who must have accidentally hit the wrong button. And that's a sign of the eroded trust that has occurred. So it's vitally important, particularly in areas like medicine, that level of trust and consent is maintained, because the trust and level that people have to put into the development of these products for the vital benefit of all is high. And respecting that and being clear with them, I think, is something that is done quite well in that space. But when we look at other users of large volumes of data, the online advertising ecosystem, parts of that, there just isn't that trust, unfortunately. And we've got to work out how we rebuild that trust. I realize it's a little trite, but the best way to build trust is to be trustful. And unfortunately, not everyone is acting in a trusted way, unlike some industries where we see where there's real leadership that could be copied by others about how you genuinely get that kind of buy-in and support for what you're doing. You want fans, not people resentfully dragged into things.
Thank you so much, Stephen Bonner. I wish we had more time. I'd love to just have you two keep chatting and us recording because it's a fantastic conversation, and it's complex, as you mentioned. The legal space can be very complex. It's not always a simple black and white solution. And we could spend a lot of time discussing this, but unfortunately we're out of time. Thank you again for joining us. We had Stephen Bamford, Head of Clinical Data Standards and Transparency at Janssen Research and Development, and Stephen Bonner, Deputy Commissioner and Executive Director of Regulatory Futures at the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK. Thank you both again. We really appreciate your time.